Mastering V-Ray Lesson 6, Working with and Tone Mapping HDRIs. Throughout the course, there's been a consistent use of high dynamic range images to light our shaders in a realistic and detailed way. However, I've yet to go into any kind of detail on the importance or power at your fingertips when working with them. Now, understanding how to work with and control your lighting through the use of HDRIs is an extremely important skill set to learn, and it's something that you won't really find anywhere else that will teach you how to do that. It's something that professional CGI studios and retouching studios keep to themselves because it's such an important and kind of personalized skill set that it gives these studios this massive advantage in creating a lot more realistic renders because their HDRIs are perfectly matching what's going on in the backplate, and you'll get your objects sitting in much better. So I'm going to explain that in this lesson, and hopefully I'm going to finally clear up for everybody something that this kind of secret that studios hold on to. And the reason why I say it's secret is because when I was working at Light Farm and Electric Art and Cream, all three of those studios when I started, didn't really know how to effectively do this. It's something I learned while on the job by looking at other high-end studios like Taylor James and Platinum in Brazil. So those type of studios, they do all this work to their HDRIs to get more realistic renders, but it's something that you just won't be taught anywhere else. So with that being said, a lot of the time my adjustments to HDRs are very subtle, but completely necessary to avoid retouchers having to go in and do those color adjustments on the final render for you. Remember, the ultimate goal in my workflow is to make the least amount of work possible for other artists around you without overburdening yourself too much. That, in my opinion, is what makes you a valuable artist. So throughout my career, I've seen quite a few artists rely on retouches to obtain the realism in the final renders, and some examples of this would be by reducing the blue fill light from the sky in the HDRI, or by painting in darker shadows so an object sits better. I've seen artists rely on dirt maps to do that also, instead of simply creating stronger overhead lighting to achieve the same result. And now most of these basic problems can be avoided with some quick and easy adjustments to your HDRI in Photoshop. So for this lesson, I've bought some HDRIs from Marground to demonstrate how to effectively tone map your HDRIs in a realistic project environment. So imagine if you're starting a new job, you go on Marground, which by the way is just a HDRI and backplate website. So say we need to put a car in this scene, you'd start out, you'd buy your backplate shot, you'd buy your HDRI, and then you'd get to work trying to integrate the car into that scene. Originally, I'd planned to use HDRIs created by Jürgen Herland. He's a fellow Mastering V-Ray subscriber, and his hobby is kind of shooting HDRIs, and he's done it for a few years now, and the quality it's ridiculous. It's kind of unmatched. However, after realizing that the majority of you guys are professionals, I decided that a lesson covering exactly how I would handle a real-world job was more informative and necessary. So to get started, I need to show you a couple of the technical settings in Photoshop to look out for when working with HDRIs, as well as my theory on the best way to view and adjust them. Now I'm inside Photoshop, and you'll see I have an HDRI loaded created by Jürgen Herland, who has an awesome talent for capturing HDRs of the best quality I've ever seen. And because of that, I'll be partnering with him to sell his HDRIs on my website as soon as we build up a bigger library. But to get back on topic, the first thing I need you to do is change the preview setting at the base of your document. By default, Photoshop will show you the document size. However, when you're working with 32-bit files, you have the ability to preview the exposure. So to do that, you need to go down here and set it to 32-bit exposure. And what this does is it gives you a preview slider to see exactly what's happening at different exposure levels in your HDRI without hard coding those adjustments. So for example, if I wanted to adjust just the very center of the sun, I'd go all the way down to this level of exposure, zoom in and make color adjustments there, instead of trying to view them here where I can't see any of that detail. Now, what I've just done is there to reset that is you can double click it. So if you double click that, it'll just snap straight back to the default exposure, and it's just a little bit of useful info to know. Another thing I'll need you to do is in the info tab, by default, you'll just get an 8-bit value when you sample pixels, and when we're working with 32-bit files, we need to change that. So what you do is you click on the eyedropper tool here, and if you set it to 32-bit, now you'll see we have a proper 32-bit value for those pixels. So when we're working with 32-bit files, the value for each pixel can go well above 1. So when you're working with 8-bit files, you'll notice that perfect white is 255, 255, 255. If I set this to 8-bit again, you'll see that when we go to the center of these pixels, it's just 255. It's not giving us the correct information there. So when you set this to 32-bit, when you're sampling those pixels, you're getting an accurate representation of how bright those pixels are. And these pixels are the exact equivalent to if you had a V-Ray light set to 100, for example. So anything above 1 is going to start introducing lighting into your scene as if it were a V-Ray light. So you'll notice now, also in 32-bit, the color picker is slightly different. Instead of it being, if I swap this to an 8-bit file, you'll notice the standard color picker, it goes up to 255. However, in 32-bit mode, in the color picker, we can go well above that to get colors brighter than 1. So if I go up into the red area here, somewhere in the red area, and we go well up on the exposure, you'll see the preview is perfectly white. And if I fill this document with that color, it's perfectly white. However, that's not the only reason it's showing that as perfectly white, is because the monitor it's not a high dynamic range monitor. You can't preview those colors above 1 unless you go down to a lower exposure. So as soon as I drop the exposure, that color starts being reintroduced. Now later in the episode, I'll show you the massive benefits this gives you when you're working with HDRIs, because you can basically paint light into your scene as if you were creating lights with standard V-Ray lights or things like that. So before we get started creating the project, I've just brought up my old Lightfarm portfolio, some of the jobs I worked on there, to give you an idea of what type of jobs utilize exactly what I'm about to teach. So on pretty much all car jobs, I do this. So if I open up this job here, the car looks realistic, but when I was working on this job, the default HDRI, which I think was from Moof, was completely unrealistic. The whole car just looked completely fake. I had to go in and make adjustments to the sky, to the backplate here, to the ground, so that when it was reflecting, it's reflecting the correct color. Remember, this is the backplate, but we are reflecting the HDRI here. And when those two don't match, it's just everything becomes very obviously CGI. So everything I'm about to teach you now is to get more realistic results straight away. This is pretty much just a beauty render. There was some tiny adjustments done in Photoshop, but it is kind of what it is. If you get your HDRI looking or tone mapped correctly, you save the retouchers so much work, because all that information is in the HDRI, and you have that ability to get fully photoreal renders straight out of V-Ray without having to change the sky, without having to change the floor color, masking off areas of the car to get them looking more realistic. So there's a few jobs where this kind of applies. For example, here, getting the sun to be the right color, bouncing off the penguins and stuff like that, just ends up giving you that more realistic result. So I go down, I've got a couple more jobs for the same thing. This car job, for example, I won't be covering something as advanced as how I lit this job, because it's utilizing HDRI Light Studio as well as an HDRI. So basically, this highlight here on the horizon is totally fake. So that's achieved by painting in light into the HDR. So I'll show you a little bit of how to do that, but basically you can see the sky here matches the same colors and tones from the backplate. And when you do that, and when you get the correct amount of shadowing happening, everything once again just kind of looks great straight out of the render. So once again, same as the previous job I showed you, this is basically just a raw render with very little retouching done. There's a bit of grade work done to the backplate, but it's, I mean, from what I've seen, some retouches are required to do. It's like days and days of work to tone map their shots to get the CG render looking realistic. Whereas this was basically just a beauty render. This job, for example, I'm pretty sure that's just a beauty render. It just came out exactly, it's a very simple job from side on, and cars are very hard to get photoreal, but once again, if you tone map your HDR correctly, it'll just sit in your scene. I'll see if there's just anything else. Yeah, for example here, this is another job where the Santa is real and we've got the reflections on the glass and things like that. But if you tone map the HDR correctly, this just sits in. So once again, pretty much just a beauty render. Not much post work needed at all. There might be some saturation adjustments, some brightness, but the retoucher doesn't have to go in and make the Santa look real. So we're back inside of Max now, and before we just rebuild this scene, this project, I'm just going to show you the end result of what I'm talking about, just so it's kind of cemented in your brain once again, the effect of tone mapping your HDRIs has on your final image. So by default here, this first render is using the Marground HDRI fully untouched. So just basically loading it into your shot and hitting render. You can see straight away that the ball just doesn't look, it doesn't look bad, it doesn't look that off, but it's, in my opinion, it looks kind of exactly like you see a lot of people online post CG renders that just don't have that little bit of extra realism. So even though the shadows are lined up, sorry, my tablet's gone a bit crazy. Even though the shadows line up and the reflections line up, the colors are totally off. The brightness is off in the shadows. You see our shadows are really light here, but in the real scene, look how dark they are. That's because there's too much ambient light by default when they shot this HDR. So if I slide to the left, I'll show you the final result. And then you can see everything becomes a lot more grounded and it's sitting in the scene a lot better. And I wouldn't even consider that final. Sometimes, I mean, for this lesson, I've got to kind of compress it and show you how you can really quickly get 95% of the way there. But a lot of the time, I'll go in and I'll just like keep making little adjustments. So a lot of the little things you need to look out for are the color of the sky, the intensity of the sky, the intensity of the ground you're reflecting. You've got the shadow color. You've got the hardness of the shadows. That's another important thing that I'm going to teach you in this lesson. So basically you've got ambient color bouncing back up into the ball. And if you notice here, what I've done is, if you see in the viewport, we've got a ground plane, which is a matte object with just a kind of very similar gray floor color. And by default, that gray floor color is reflecting blue because there's so much blue in the HDRI color casting into the scene. And you get that unrealistic look because of it. So when you're reflecting, you can see the ground plane that's invisible reflecting back up into the ball here. If you see there, the edge of it, the color doesn't line up. Whereas in the post-adjusted HDRI, the colors are a lot closer and you can't tell that there's even a ground plane under there reflecting back up. So I'm going to rebuild this scene for you now, step by step. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it. I'm going to label everything I do that's important, and hopefully I can kind of complete that in a relatively quick time. You've got to remember, this isn't scientific kind of skill set to learn. It's very visual, it's very creative, and you need to have a good eye for looking at your backplate and tablet's gone crazy. Looking at your backplate and then looking at your HDRI and making those adjustments step by step. So I've got a clean scene set up here, which is just the basic shader ball scene with everything stripped out of it. There's no shaders, there's no backplate. The settings are the same, and this is why I start off with this scene, because I already know it's optimized. And even though I might need to make some tweaks later on, it just gives you a perfect starting point. For example, if I was working on a car job and in the past I'd created a silver car paint shader, and I knew that I had to put a silver car into this scene, I know that I've got that head start there. So I'd open up the scene with the silver shader in it, I'd strip everything else, and the first thing you want to do is you want to put your camera in. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize 3ds Max 2014's camera match tools, and to do that we're just going to put a standard target camera in. The reason I put a target camera in first, even though that target camera won't work with the perspective match tools, you'll see in a second, is because if we put a free camera in, it just saves you one little step of having to rotate the camera into place. So with this scene selected, with that camera selected, I'm going to change the camera from that typical shader ball camera. We're going to make it the normal standard camera. I'm just going to rotate around a little bit. And if I go into the Utilities tab, and if I click Perspective Match and Show Vanishing Lines, you'll see that it says down the bottom here, target cameras are not supported by Perspective Match. Please use a free camera. So I'm just going to go into the camera setting and change that to a free camera down here. And now we lose the target point. So if I go back into this shot, the first thing I want to do is load the reference image into the backplate. So if you hit Alt-B, it'll load the viewport configuration tab, and I can set it to use files, and then I can load the file from here. And you'll see that I've got the Marground backplate. Now the first thing you want to do when you click this is memorize the statistics so you've got the correct viewport size. So at the moment it's 2900 by 2175. So I'm going to load that in. And you'll see that it gets loaded in. And then I'm going to change the output size to match the backplate. So 2900 by 2175, and that'll give you an image aspect ratio of 1.33, which is just industry standard for your typical Hasselblad camera, or most high-end cameras will have this aspect ratio. So now that we've got the backplate matched, you see that the camera's totally out. So we're going to go back into the Utilities tab, and I'm going to click Show Vanishing Lines. Now this time it should all load, and you can see here we've got all the different X, Y, and Z angles that we can line up. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to go right click this little plus checkbox, and we're going to enable 2D pen and zoom, another 3ds Max 2014 feature that's awesome. What it lets you do is it lets you move your viewport around without changing the camera. So we can zoom in at a pixel level and refine exactly how aligned these perspective match tools are. So I'm just going to move the material editor out of the way, and if I just drag the red axis lines to match the footpath, I know that I've got that perspective right. Same goes for this one. You want to try and align these in the biggest area and the biggest line possible in the scene. That way you know you'll have the closest match. Okay, so the background here, you can see we're able to align up here. The vertical lines we can match up, and the vertical lines usually, unless there's a lot of camera distortion, will just be vertical anyway. It's pretty rare that a company like Marground will release a backplate which is very off, that has a lot of vertical distortion in it. So by default you kind of get a nice clean match. Now lastly, you can see here we've got this line down here, And now all of a sudden, very, very quickly, using these new tools, everything lines up absolutely perfectly. So you can see this line here on the grid plane is lining up. This line here is lining up, and everything's matching perfectly. So the first thing I want to do is, when I'm done with matching the camera, you can just turn off the show vanishing lines, and then we're back. And then I can turn off the 2D pen and zoom, and now we'll just go back to having a perfectly clean matched camera. I'm just going to move this ground plane because the default shadable scenes offset this a little bit to be a little bit further back in the perspective. It's not lined up to the center of the scene, you'll see, just because we needed more ground space behind. I'm just going to move that back to 0, and then I'm just going to scale it. Alright, so with that being completed, I'm just going to make a standard V-Ray material. I'm just going to make it fully reflective and leave that Fresnel on, just so we've got a very basic shader to work with when we're matching the lighting. I'm just going to apply a V-Ray material to the ground plane, and just going to leave that as is. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the HDR, and remember, I'm doing this exactly how I would do a real project. You're seeing exactly what happens every single time, and you'll quickly see how easy and kind of simple it is to get something looking realistic and matching. It's not that hard. However, it took me years and years and years to get to this point where I even knew this stuff, because no one teaches you it. It's crazy, but no one shows you just this kind of simple process of how to get everything lining up. So I'm going to load up the material editor again, and we're just going to drag our default HDR over into an empty slot, and you'll see it's just kind of empty. So whenever I was releasing those material files to you and it didn't have an HDR loaded, this is the kind of process I wanted you to go through and just to load up your own HDR. So you can see it's empty at the moment, and I'm just going to load up the basic Marground HDR. I'm just going to load that into Photoshop, and you can see the default HDR looks a little bit different to our final tone mapped HDR here. So I'm just going to hide that for now, and you can just see when we are working with these Marground HDRs, if I go down on the slider, on the exposure slider, the sun is good, but it doesn't have as much exposure range as, say, Jorgen's HDRs. So just to compare them, if we go here and I slide all the way down, you see the sun starts to, everything at this kind of exposure level starts to lose that detail. And that's because they haven't shot these HDRs with a larger bracketed range. So they don't physically have that detail down there. And what that does is it means you have to kind of manually boost the contrast in the HDR to get that detail back. Whereas if we go into Jorgen's HDR, if we slide all the way down here, you see all the way down, even just to the most minute level, the sun is still visible because he's captured that information. So it's giving you a much truer exposure range on the sun, which is what you want to give you that perfect realism. And having an HDR like this will give you a better result than using a standard V-Ray sun, because you've got all this extra detail in the flare, and all that information will ping off your shader ball. I'm just going to load that in. By default, everything should be set up. I'm just going to reset the rotation. If you just right click one of these, it'll just reset it to 0. It's just a quick way of doing that. And then I'm going to load up the settings box. I'm just going to go through everything one last time, double check it's all good. We know that because I've loaded this from a previous scene, the settings are going to be kind of very close to optimize, and then I can hit render. So the first thing that's happened is our HDR isn't lined up and it's visible and we don't have the backplate in the scene. But you can see now that this default Marground HDRI is lighting the scene. We've got some basic shadows and a rough idea of kind of how bright everything's going to be. So let me just fix up the environment now. So in the environment tab, I'm just going to load up that background from background plate from Marground. It's just finishing off some of the bloom and glare there. Just going to load that in, and I'm going to drag that also into the material editor slot and change it. When you load this, it'll load it as a spherical environment. You want that to be set to screen. Now, whenever you've got something in the V-Ray environment tab, you need to make sure that in your environment slot here, that these are ticked to black. If you don't, it will treat it as if you had it loaded in here like this. And you'll end up getting a double color cast through your image because the HDRI is lighting the scene and the background is lighting the scene. So just as a reminder to clear these and make them black whenever you're working with an image in the environment map slot. I've actually got some jobs on my folio back when I was really new to rendering, where you can actually see the backplate being color cast through the image if you zoom in on the high res, because I had it set to screen. And I was like, I never really knew why it was doing that, but it kind of ruined a couple of jobs and it was too late. They were already sent, so it's just a important heads up there. So now if I render again, you should see that the backplate's being loaded. Nope, because I haven't made the HDRI invisible. So I've just got to let it do the bloom and glare again. I'll turn that off next time so it's not slowing us down. I'm just going to tick that to be invisible. And now you can see that we're starting to integrate our shader ball into the backplate. Now the next process, it will be aligning the shadows and aligning that background HDR to the scene. So how I used to do this was, and it's a pretty cool little trick, if I go into the HDR, I'm going to show you the way I do it now though. Just go into the V-Ray frame buffer here and turn off the bloom and glare so it's not slowing us down. Okay, I can close that. So what I used to do is in the environment slot, I'd load the backplate, HDRI, in the background tab. If you click use environment background now, you'll see that you've got the HDRI loaded. And so I can rotate this in real time and have everything line up. So I'm just going to click flip horizontally. And we need to figure out where exactly this HDR is in space. So in Photoshop, I'm just going to look for a little bit of reference. And you can see here in the background, we've got this kind of Goodyear sign and the stoplights. So if we go back into Max now and we rotate, you can see the Goodyear sign here, and we've got the lights. And we can kind of roughly line up to get that same angle. And that way we know, but by doing this, what's happening is, say the sun's over here, it's going to be casting shadows in the correct direction, and our reflections are going to be in the same direction. Now the problem sometimes is with getting things truly matched, unless you're shooting things yourself, and a lot of CGI studios will do that. They'll go out and shoot the HDRs themselves. But if you don't have that option and you're using something from Marground, you'll notice that the location where this HDR was shot, which was kind of somewhere down here on the corner of this road, is that it doesn't line up to where the backplate was shot. So our backplate was shot around here, but the actual HDR was shot around here, around this area. So the reflections won't be matching up 100%. But sometimes you've just got to live with that. That's just the nature of the job. So that was the old way I used to do things, but it's not ideal because you can't really see the shadows in the viewport and you don't have a perfect idea of where things are. So the way I do things now is I might start out doing it this way, but then I'll swap to using V-Ray real-time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load the backplate back into the environment slot, and you can see if we just swap those out there, it's kind of very similar, but it might not be perfect. So I'm going to load active shade up, and I've got to make sure the resolution's the same. In this particular instance, it already was set up, but make sure that you've got the same image aspect ratio in V-Ray real time as you do in the production render. So it should still be 1.33. So in active shade, if I load the scene up and start it rendering, we can see we get a kind of a subtle idea of where things are, but the shadows aren't fully visible. So what we can do to help that is we can exaggerate the sun's intensity in Photoshop, and that should give us a better idea of the shadows being cast into the scene. V-Ray real-time doesn't do a great job of rendering out shadows. I can demonstrate that by closing down real-time and going back into the production render. And if I go here and just render a standard region using the production render, these shadows will be much more visible. But if I want to go back into RT, what I can do in Photoshop is, in the default HDR being used, if we slide down here and we see the sun, if I zoom in on that sun, steal just this hot point here, and copy and paste it, I can increase the intensity of just that area. So now when we go down lower, we're going to have a much brighter sun. And I'll just quickly paint away around the edges there. And if I save this HDR off, I'm going to call it less than 6, increase sun. Now when the HDR used, I can load up less than 6, increase sun, and the shadows are a bit more visible. So I just paused the video there, and I was kind of wondering, sometimes you're doing something while you're recording and it just doesn't behave the way it should. Now what I forgot to realize is when I loaded that HDR, because we dragged it straight in and changed it, what I didn't realize is that there was a color correction laid over the top of it. So that HDR was nested inside the color correction, and it was a bit of a placebo effect there, but basically V-Ray Real-Time doesn't support the color correction texture. So if I drag that HDR into this slot here, so we're using the default HDR, now all of a sudden we can see the actual shadow. And you'll get what I was doing earlier when I was trying to increase the sun intensity. So now if I load the old Marground HDR, the default one, you can see that the shadow's less visible. And we don't have as good an indication of where the shadow's coming from. So when we went and did those Photoshop adjustments to make the sun brighter, now when we load that HDR, you can see the sun's shadow being much more affected. And we can just rotate the HDR to fit better or worse. So the more I rotate it, the more the shadow's coming around to the left there. I just want to have the shadow coming a little bit more towards us. And I'm just going to go back into the Photoshop file on the back plate and just kind of zoom in. You can see this telegraph pole here. It's coming at a kind of pretty nearly directly towards us, just a little bit off. And we've kind of got that happening here. So if I just set that to 30, we know we've got things lined up. And now I'm just going to load the original Marground HDR. So if I close down, that's all I need active shade for at the moment, because I always like to work with the production render when after that point's done. I still think V-Ray Real-Time is just a little bit limited. A little bit limited, and I just prefer to use the production render. So if I just do a render of this, I'm going to change the resolution to be a little bit smaller. And this will be our starting point. Whoops. It's loaded in the wrong camera. And the first thing you'll notice that looks completely off when working in this scene is that there's way too much blue in the sky. So that blue doesn't correspond with the blue from the backplate. You can see it's more, there's 0.483 blue there. Oh, sorry, it's a little bit brighter in the background. Basically, there's too much blue. There's too much blue in the sky, and you can see that blue from the HDR being color cast onto the ground here. The next thing you'll notice is that the shadows aren't the right intensity, and they're not the right color either. So I'm going to pause the video here, and we're going to go back into Photoshop, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown on how we're going to adjust that photo. So when you're about to begin tone mapping your HDR, the first kind of obvious thing you'll need to be able to do is you'll need to be able to mask off the sky from the floor. Sometimes you'll even need to mask the floor from the mid areas, say like the buildings and the ground here, from the sky also. So you'll have 3 different masks. Now because we're working with an HDR and this isn't directly visible in the render, it's only visible in the reflections, you can be a little bit more lenient in how you go about masking things off. So a professional retoucher will go in and properly clear cut around all the buildings, but a lot of the times I don't have time for that, and I've got to do it in a very quick and efficient way that gets you 80%, 90% the way there with little to no effort. So one thing you can do, and I'll demonstrate it first on a HDR where it'll be a little bit more obvious, is on this HDR here, where let's just say I want to mask off the sky, but in the horizon you can see we've got a whole bunch of trees and mountains and little bits of detail that is going to be difficult to mask off quickly. Now I could just go in and just mask it off, just making a straight line through it and then painting in there. But another thing you can do is if I put an exposure adjustment on this, and you can see here, if I go up on the exposure, because the sky is much brighter than the ground next to it, we get a kind of white bloom happening around that horizon line. Now, because we're in 32-bit, if I collapse that exposure, make this image grayscale, and then copy and paste that, I can undo that by going Control-Alt-Z and getting back our original HDR. If I make a new document and make sure it's 8-bit, I can paste that in, and using the magic wand tool, let's just say I set it to just a smaller, I can just select that area, sometimes you need to go up a little bit higher, and very quickly, by adding to the selection here, we get a very rough mask of the horizon line. So if I go and make a new layer and fill that with white, and then invert the selection by using Control, Shift, and I together, if I hit X, it'll invert the selection in your color palette, and if I hit Alt Backspace, I can fill the foreground with black. And so very quickly we've created a mask of that sky. So if I copy and paste that by going Control A, Control C, we go back into the HDR. If I make an exposure adjustment layer, I can go into the channels palette, I can click make it visible, and I can paste that in. And now I've pasted the mask that we just created directly into that exposure adjustment layer. And now I can adjust the sky independently of the foreground and the ground itself. So it's a very quick way of doing things. Now in this particular HDR, we've got a very clear line defining the horizon. Some HDRs are a little bit trickier, and you just need to be a little bit messier and try and work things out in a little bit rougher way. But once again, we're only using this for reflection and lighting, and a lot of the time the reflection in these areas isn't going to be very clearly visible on the car or whatever object you're lighting anyway. So you can get away with a lot more. So if I go down on the exposure here, I'm just going to see we've got a clear idea of what's going to happen here. I'm going to assume around the tree it's going to need a little bit of work because that's not as clearly defined, and we've got bits of the sky showing up through the tree, so it might be more beneficial just to paint in the whole sky itself. But I'm going to use the exact same process here to give me a head start using that mask, in creating that mask. Just going to flatten the image and copy it and undo that. Make a new file, make sure it's 8-bit. Sorry, what I've done incorrectly here is in the preview slider, I have forgot to reset that, and you can see it's blown out a little bit. So I was actually copying and pasting that. So I need to go down on the exposure here. And just lift it up to about there. And then copy and paste that. And now using the magic wand tool, I can just select the sky here, select around the tree. We get the buildings, and we get a rough rough mask. So I'm going to create a new layer, fill it with white, Control-Shift-I, X, Alt, backspace, and there we've got a mask for the horizon. Copy, paste that, delete this document. In this exposure adjustment, in this hue adjustment, actually, you know what? I'm just going to start completely from scratch. I'm going to delete all this stuff. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a hue and saturation, because what I'm doing here is I'm going to remove the blue from the sky, or as much blue from the sky. So a typical problem with HDRs is that you have a very, very cyany blue fill that doesn't exist in the backplates. That's because when you're shooting an HDR, it's tone mapping, the sky's a lot brighter, and you end up getting a lot of color cast that shouldn't actually be there. So to compensate that, you just put a hue and saturation adjustment on. First thing you want to do is you want to get the tone of your hue correct. So in the sky here, you can see ours is a little bit greener than here, just subtly. And it might take you a little bit of getting used to realize that. But if I just go left and right here, you can see the effect that's having on the sky. So for this particular HDR, I just want to bring a little bit more in. So like you can see the difference between -10 is just bringing a bit of that color. And even though this is very subtle, this is exactly the type of stuff that will get your renders 100% sitting into your scene. So after you've adjusted your main hue, you want to go into the cyan and you want to remove that, so you can see the cyan, how that's what that is affecting in the backplate. If I go down here and we just preview that on and off, you can see the effect that's already had on the sky. If I go into the blues now, just want to remove those a little bit too. Now there is a little bit of blue, you can see in the shadows here on a white object. Remember, these objects have a little bit of color in them, that the ground has a bit of yellow tint to it, same as the concrete on these buildings. Whereas if you find a object in the scene which is a bit closer to white, you can see that there is a bit of that blue still being cast into the scene and on the metals and stuff like that. So very subtle things to look out for there. You can even sometimes look at the reference in the reflections of windows and stuff to get an idea of how much blue is actually being cast into the scene. Now the only real way of doing this is to eyeball it. So I mean, you can see if I completely get rid of the blue, the effect that has. But I'm just going to reduce it just a bit. I'm going to go -50, so we've got half as much. And you can see after making that very first hue and saturation adjustment, there's quite a big change to the image. One thing I am going to do while I'm working on that, so when you do your first mask, is